I'm Mark Henick. This is Modern Minds Rewind. Here's my conversation with Dr. Dan Siegel. So there's been a lot of media coverage lately about the mental health challenges that teens are facing. And I want to get your thoughts on how we can help with that. But, first, having read a number of your books, I thought we could start with a little conversation about attachment. It seems like we stop talking about attachment after the first 5 years, even the first 3 years. So could you give us a little bit more of an idea of the importance of that bond and how it extends and evolves, not just in childhood, but throughout the teenage years as well?
Absolutely. Well, attachment is a word we use in science for the relationship between a child and their caregiver. So that could be the parent, it could be a relative, another individual. We actually can have a few attachment figures in our lives, but that need for connection to others doesn't just stay in childhood. It's present throughout our lives, actually, and we're extremely social beings. So, for example, during adolescence, we need our parents, we need other caregivers, and we start transferring that close connection to our peers. And it's that disconnection during the pandemic that may have been an important feature for why we're seeing so much distress now, because attachment relationships basically not only help us feel better because we're connected, but we learn how to shape our own internal world, how to know who we are through these important relationships. And when we don't have them, we can feel very disconnected and despairing. So attachment lasts throughout our lifespans.
Now, so much that I think the conversation around teenagers who are struggling, it seems to start with the premise that there's something quote unquote wrong with them, that there's a neurobiological or a psychological defect of sorts, and we need to find a cure for it. I'm going to put a pin in that externalization of the problem for a second, because what I really want to talk about is how we can talk about the interconnected role that parents have to play in their kids' struggles and their joys for that matter, but without making it seem like we're blaming or shaming parental behavior as the cause of their kids' mental illness. How can we talk about the other causes that are not all in the teenager's head?
Absolutely. Well, I think speaking about the teenager's head, what we've learned in the last 20 years or so is that there's a remodeling process that goes on in the adolescent brain. And it's this change in the connections, initially a loss in connections that's needed to actually to refine the specialization of the brain. And then as the later periods of the adolescent time of life go on, you have increased connections with the laying down of something called myelin. So when we say remodeling, it's this pruning down of existing connections and this laying down of new strengths among the connected neurons. Now, we say all that because there's an essence of adolescence I talk about in a book called Brainstorm that I wrote actually for adolescents themselves so they could understand what's their emotional spark. So, emotions are more intense. And so that does not mean pathology, it just means passion. Yet there is a downside to this because they can get overwhelmed by their own emotions. And if we're going to develop an emotional quote disorder like depression or manic depressive illness, it's most likely to have its first onset during the adolescent period. So we need to distinguish this emotional spark from emotional disorder. And that's an important distinction to make. Then we have the social engagement where adolescents may start to push against us and go to their peers more. And across all cultures, that's a natural way where adolescents begin to establish their social connectivity. The downside is you can give up morality to gain membership. So we need to support adolescents in thinking clearly, kind of driven by an internal compass on how to properly set up their emotional connections. The pandemic has made that also very difficult. The N of essence, this is an acronym, is novelty seeking. And this is where an adolescent is really trying on new things. And that's for a number of different neurological reasons this is happening. But the behavioral manifestation is they can to be taking risks. That's the downside that actually literally endanger them or their peers. And so helping adolescents during this period, which is filled with risk, that's necessary for them to take to learn about the world, is an important part of how we as adults can support them. And then finally, the CE is creative explorations. The big new ways of approaching things come from adolescent minds. And so we need to see this and support this rather than see it as a pathology. So that's
Hmm.
it. That's adolescence in a nutshell, Mark. When you think about the remodeling and what it does, and how we should be careful to distinguish between disorder and development.
Right. And I mean, teenagers, or any of us for that matter, we're not just brains in jars. We live in intraconnected and interconnected worlds. And I think
Yeah.
our parents, of course, as kids and as teenagers, are critical parts of that world. And there's this been the idea for a very long time now, popularized by Winnicott, of the good enough parent, and that for me evokes the idea that we all fall down, and in fact that perfection arguably is counterproductive when it comes to parenting. The arguments, the fights, the disagreements, the mismatch and repair. I mean, how does that actually strengthen the bond with the teenager?
Well, exactly. Well, first of all, what it shows the teenager is that you are human, that you're human, not perfect. And in recognizing that we may have a direction we're aiming for, but we don't always get there, we can accept that sometimes we make mistakes, we make blunders. And in all the parenting books that I write, I try to write about my own, sometimes to my own children's dismay. They said, "Why are you letting the world know what a jerk you can be?" And I said, "That's exactly what I want to do." They said, "What's wrong with you?" Which is a good question for them to ask. But it's not because I'm writing about this, because as you're pointing out, Mark, we are really given the opportunity to be present as parents, not perfect. Now, what that means, though, is that if we do make a blunder, we want to go back and make a repair to that ruptured connection. And what that does is it teaches adolescents that, okay, if they make mistakes, they can say, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that, but I see the error of my ways. Can we reconnect and start over again?" And that's what the value of us doing it as parents is. It actually teaches our adolescents how to do that too.
I think that it's so easy as parents, also as teens, as just anybody, to get all tangled up in your own stuff, right? We get on these trips, these power trips, anger trips, whether it's grief or self-righteousness, whatever. You often don't even know that you're on a trip until you come back home from it again, back to your emotional home, that is. So, when you get into that kind of entanglement or enmeshment with a teenager who themselves is dealing with a lot of powerful emotions, in those moments, how do you remember to be in it but not of it? Yeah, how do you extricate yourself so that way you can be a more calm parent?
That's a beautiful way to say it, to be, uh, you know, in it, but, of it, but not totally swallowed up by it. Um, there are a number of things you could do in the basic notion of keep the lines of communication open. We have to do exactly what you're saying, Mark. We have to start with our inner life. So I actually recommend to parents to make sure themselves they do. There was a book I wrote called Parenting from the Inside Out with Mary Hartsold, and it gives parents a guide to say, what was my own journey when I was a kid, that I learned certain strategies of dealing with what I was immersed in. And then what that does is it builds on the attachment research finding that the best way you can show up for your child so they can have what's called a secure attachment is not what happened to you, but how you've come to make sense of what happened to you. Now, that finding, when I heard it from the research from Mary Main and colleagues at Berkeley, was so empowering, because what it means is you can work with parents, whether it's clinically or in workshops or in educational settings like we're in right now, and say, the real path you can take to show up is to first make sense of your own childhood history. What did you go through? What happened to you? What do you remember about it? How did you adapt to what happened to you? And how have all those experiences and adaptation to those experiences stayed with you now as an adult? And how are they shaping, for good or not so good, your parenting now? And then how would you like to be? So that making sense process is the number one thing to start with. And that's what I offer to parents, not only with parenting from the inside out, but with a tool where you can learn to reflect inwardly called the wheel of awareness. And it's something else parents can do to retain that calmness, even in the face of a storm.
We parent as we were parented in many ways, whether we recognize it or not. I think it's easy for parents to fall into this trap of fixer fixation. My kid is broken and I want to fix them. And you desperately want to help them because that's your heart out there walking around outside your body, suffering, struggling, stumbling, and it can feel powerless. Yet, I think at the same time, sometimes that clinging seems to create more friction between parents and teens. Sometimes it can alienate and push people away when, at least this is how I felt when I was a teen struggling. Maybe I'm just putting too much of my own stuff into this, but it feels like you're being treated like a project rather than really getting to know your kid. So I guess I'm wondering about the role of acceptance here, not resignation or giving up or throwing up your hands, but how do you really practice that radical acceptance with your kid and their suffering and their hurting and all of it?
Yeah, it's such a great question, especially in light of the reports that have just come out about the really terrifying increase in depression, anxiety, addiction, self harming behavior, and suicide among youth, including adolescents. So,
Mhm.
this is a very serious moment in the United States with these really huge epidemic proportions of childhood mental distress. So, what can we say about it in terms of your question? I think it's a really important issue, the idea of acceptance. In many ways, there's a fundamental process called integration, where you both differentiate on the one hand and link on the other. And so, the pathway to the acceptance you're talking about, Mark, is really to look deeply. And all my books, including the parenting books, are about integration, really. And so, for a parent, what does that mean? That means you may expect your adolescent to be a certain way and try to make them be that way rather than seeing who they actually are. So you're differentiating and then linking by keeping the channels of communication open. So often, I'm a family therapist, and often when I see families where there's struggles with adolescents, it's where one of the parents or both are really having a hard time differentiating their own expectations or their own experience in their childhood from what this individual, their adolescent, is going through right now. When we can tease that apart and recognize the essence of adolescence we spoke about, then it's really helpful. And the parents can read, brainstorm also. With that as a guide, you can see, okay, I see these are the fundamental changes of adolescence. When I allow differentiation to emerge and yet set up channels of communication, so linkages there, often what before seemed like a disorder turns out to just be a moment of disconnection. That allows acceptance to really be fully there because then you're seeing who your child really is. Now, sometimes something is emerging that actually is not about the relationship with you, the parent. It's about disconnection from peers or spending too much time on social media, for example, getting a feeling of missing out or a feeling of inadequacy. And as we said, because of this remodeling, some of the major psychiatric disorders can emerge during this period of brain remodeling. And so we need to also realize that sometimes it's not about our relationship with our adolescent. There's something else going on. And sometimes getting professional help is really essential to distinguish, is this just a developmental phase or is this actually a disorder that's emerging that could use professional support? So we don't want to freak people out, but we do want to honor that adolescence is a period of a lot of changes. And so if you begin feeling like there's something really going in a wrong direction, acceptance is good, but also accepting that this is what's going on and seeking help can be a part of that acceptance. Acceptance is really seeing things for how they actually are. It doesn't mean doing nothing.
Hmm. And you mentioned some of the really concerning statistics, of course, that we've been seeing. So I guess I'm just wondering, before we wrap up, do you think that this is a case of different generations, not knowing what's going on with younger generations? That's a perennial problem, or is there something different now? Are the kids okay now?
It's a great question. You have these great questions, Mark. What I would say is this, and I tried to talk about this in this new book, IntraConnected. In the United States, especially, more than any other country, actually, we have a very individualistic stance about life that, you're born into a body and who you are is your body and that's yourself, that's you. You should take that body and make sure it does what it needs to do. This individualism is actually quite a conflict with a deeper biological reality that we're incredibly social. So that when you then add to the adolescent period of the brain remodeling, the whole exposure to social media, and now 3 years into a pandemic, you have isolation. So these messages that you're supposed to be okay by yourself, but then you get on social media and you see how everyone is curating these images that look like they're all so happy when they're actually not, but it appears that way. And then you can't reach out and develop these friendships because of the virus that's keeping you separated. And now parents are stressed out and all these things happening in the world with social injustice, with climate crisis, just to name two. Well, the polarization of misinformation, that's a third one. All these, what you call pandemics, are making this different, I think, from any other period. We've never faced a moment in looking, for example, at the climate issue where repeatedly we're getting messages in the news from panels of scientists that are saying we have about a 10-year period to alter the way we live in modern culture, or it will be past a tipping point. Kids pick that up. Children and adolescents are picking that up. And we need to give them an empowerment to be able to participate in doing something about that. I think this isolated solo self view of who the individual is as separate is actually creating some of this problem with even the climate crisis. So it's going to be a win-win situation if we can really bring our relationality, our connection, our social identities together to work together. But I think this is a serious moment. It isn't just, oh, every generation is like this. We've never seen mental suffering as high as it is now in our youth, ever. And that's not just, oh, people are alone, let's get them back in school. There's a lot of things going on, and we need to really work together to deal with this crisis.
Well, and thankfully, we have people like you who are offering some really insightful advice and strategies to help with that. Dr. Dan Siegel, your latest book is Interconnected: We, Me plus We, and the Integration of Self, Identity, and Belonging. Thanks so much for joining me on Modern Minds today, Dan.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for revisiting this conversation with me on Modern Minds Rewind. You can listen, watch, and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also stay in touch with me at Mark Henick, that's at MarkHenick, on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. Until next time, I've been Mark Henick, host of the Modern Minds podcast for the Hartford Healthcare Behavioral Health Network.